Hello and welcome to this episode of the Geoeconomic Agenda, a podcast from the Institute of Geoeconomics of the Asia-Pacific Initiative in Tokyo that investigates the connections between economics, politics, business, and society. I'm your host, Paul Nadeau, and I'm a visiting researcher here at the IOG. Okay, today I'm sitting down with Dr. Narges Bajoghli and Dr. Vali Nasser. They are the authors of How Sanctions Work, Iran and the Impact of Economic Warfare from Stanford University Press, along with other co-authors, Javad Salehi Esfahani and Ali Vaez. So Dr. Bajoghli, Dr. Nasser, thanks so much for joining me today. So I'll start off with the easy and maybe obvious question, the one that's right there on the cover of your book. So how do sanctions work? And this can be for either one of you.
First off, thanks so much for having us and for having this conversation. The question is often asked in policy circles and in sort of those who think about and discuss foreign policy of do sanctions work? And the more that we looked into this issue, the more that we did our research and read across cases, the more that we began to realize that's actually not the right question to ask, because with a country with the economic size and influence of the United States, when they begin to sanction different countries, of course, sanctions work, right? Because the type of pressure that sanctions from the US put on a country do certain kinds of things in a society and in politics. And the bigger question then for us came, well, then how do they work? And do they work in the ways in which they are intended? Sanctions are usually intended to do a number of different things. Among them, sort of the ones that are most talked about and most sort of focused on are either that they put enough pressure on the political establishment to make certain kinds of changes, or they put enough pressure and pain, economic pain, on the populations to rise up and force changes by the governing establishment. So either way, it's supposed to inflict pain to cause certain kinds of changes. And what we realize is that it doesn't do that, but it does a lot of other things.
What other things? What kind of other things?
Go ahead, Vali, if you want to.
Well, first of all, we found out with the reliance on the case of Iran, which I have to say, it's important because Iran has been the most sanctioned country for the longest period of time. Literally, sanctions started right after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, first in response to Iran taking American diplomats hostage. The sanctions have only increased over time. And then after President Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, Iran was the first country to be put under maximum sanctions possible. And so until Russia invaded Ukraine, Iran was perhaps the most sanctioned country in the world for the longest period of time. And if you're going to examine sanctions, and as Narges said, if you're going to really look at how this foreign policy tool of the United States works, there's no country better than Iran. Now, in our public discourse, we often talk about, well, sanctions are a substitute for war, and it's there to change the behavior of a government. So what we found in the case of Iran is that it hasn't changed the behavior of the government, actually. It actually has made the behavior of the Iranian government worse. And in fact, the harsher the sanctions became, the worse Iran's behavior became. Right. So after maximum pressure that President Trump assumed would within 6 months cause Iran to grovel on its knees, beg for a deal and surrender, actually Iran's nuclear program has expanded now to being virtually on the threshold of being a nuclear state. Its behavior in the region, which the United States has found troublesome, has actually got worse, much worse. Its role in the war in Ukraine, its missile program has got worse, and domestically, Iran has become far more aggressive, dictatorial, hardline, at least until this very last election. That was definitely the case. We witnessed the uprisings in Iran in 2022. And I would like Narges to sort of dig into this further, but a couple of things very clear to us. One is that by pushing an economy into the black market, out of normal channels that are governed by market rules and rule of law, internationally and domestically, into some gray area, you both criminalize an economy and securitize an economy, right? So the more sanctions pressure means the dirtier Iran's economies become, the more it's controlled by the revolutionary guards, and the less it's engine for democracy anymore, right? That you hope as sort of a middle class would be an engine for democracy. And it has also changed Iran's society in important ways. I mean, sanctions destroys the middle class, which is the engine for change, for progress, for democracy, for liberal economic behavior. And so what we've witnessed in Iran is that the actual impact of sanctions on Iran is opposite of everything the United States and the West claims. And in a sense, you're not also punishing the government, which has become more entrenched. You're punishing the people, very people that the West claims that it is supporting. But Narges, please, you've done a lot more close look at the social impact of this.
Sure. So, as Vadi was just mentioning, when a state becomes sanctioned, when an economy is sanctioned in the ways that Iran has been, it's not like a state like Iran is going to put its hands up and say, okay, we're sorry, the United States, or we're sorry, the West, that you don't like us or you don't like what we're doing. Let us do whatever we can to come into your good graces. That's not how states like Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, Russia, that's not how they function. That's not what their political culture is about. In actuality, they are all about pushing up against these kinds of what they would call bullying from the West, right? So when they come under that kind of economic pressure and sanctions, they are going to look for ways, and they look for ways to bust through these sanctions. So sanctions busting is what Vadi was talking about, which means that market forces go into the black and gray markets because states are looking for ways to continue their trade and continue the business of their country, right? And have things come in and out of their borders. Now, in Iran, as well as every other sanctioned country that we've looked at, who the entities that control the borders are the military establishment. So in that means that there's a lot of things coming through these borders that are under a sanctioned regime, not allowed to. So then therefore they're coming in on the black market. There's a lot of bribes that are happening. There's a lot of kickback that's happening, and there's a lot that is being exchanged in cash. So what that means is that the military establishments, their wealth begins to mushroom under a sanctions regime. And there are all of these subsidiary businesses that are created to sustain that kind of trade. And so over time, and especially in a case like Iran, where it's been about 40 years of sanctions, but especially these maximum pressure sanctions going towards, a little bit less than a decade now, in that kind of atmosphere, all of these business entities that are tied to the military and political elites becomes exponentially wealthy. At the same time, as Vadi is saying, the middle class declines very, very heavily.
So there's a lot to unpack from what you have both said, and I'm trying to figure out where to go with it next. I guess we can start with a little bit of history, because you said, Iran has been sanctioned since the revolution, 1979. It has been, until the invasion of Ukraine, the most sanctioned country in the world. And so when I hear the question, do sanctions work? The next question I ask myself is, okay, what are they trying to do? So when we being the United States, I shouldn't, insert myself as an American into this, but when the United States first started off with this sanctions program, you mentioned it was in retaliation for the hostage taking at the US Embassy. That ended a long time ago. What kept all of this going? What kept sustaining the sanctions program and having it, develop into the maximum pressure campaign that we see today? What's the evolution of the goal for the United States?
So when sanctions were first developed in the aftermath of World War I, they were sort of seen, as Vadi had mentioned before, as like an alternative to war, right? So folks at that time were looking around at the carnage of World War I and saying, we need to create some form of coercion against states that we don't like or we think are doing bad things, in order to not have them do bad things, but not lead to outright war. And so the idea of economic sanctions came about, and Woodrow Wilson actually at that time said, that no state can withstand the pressure of economic sanctions and this kind of suffocation, that they will come to the table regardless. And actually what we've seen is that as sanctions have developed as a tool in US and Western foreign policy, this comes back to your question, which is that they are extremely sticky. It is, especially US sanctions, they are extremely difficult to get off the books.
There's no power stronger than the status quo.
Exactly.
One
Well,
of my
and that,
rules.
and the fact that US sanctions are actually spread out across different agencies, right? So
Okay, that's an interesting point.
Iran will get sanctioned for one thing, and then Congress will enact other kinds of sanctions on Iran, and then the executive branch will enact other kinds of sanctions. So when Obama, for example, does the JCPOA and retreat, and says, I'm going to take away, or I'm going to do sanctions lifting as a carrot, he's only able to take away the sanctions which he has a purview over in the executive branch. And actually, the professional sanctions don't go anywhere. And Eddie can talk a lot more about this. But that becomes a tremendous sticking point that then states like Iran and Russia and others learn that once you come under US sanctions, you're not getting off of them. So then therefore, there is no incentive to do things that the United States wants you to do in order to come off of them. Please go ahead.
No, I think that's probably the most important point about this, because sanctions are, as Narges mentioned, are imposed as a way of conducting foreign policy without bullets. So at some level, and what we say about Iran is very instructive about China, a country which is very important to Japan. It's very important about Russia. So the lessons of Iran are very important because we are all sort of running down a hill at speed towards the same kind of policy we've had with Iran, but with these much larger consequential economies and great powers in the world. So you end up in a situation in which probably the most important and impactful part of sanctions is, first, obviously, you do hurt people on the other side, average Iranians, for instance. But it also serves the political needs of a government of the United States back home, because it allows a US administration to pretend like it's doing something when it either doesn't want to do something or can't do something. So, the Russians execute Alexander Navalny, and the United States puts 250 Russians under sanctions. The number is big, it looks good, it makes the Biden administration look like they did something when they either have nothing more to do or don't want to do. And so sanctions basically becomes a very effective for administrations, not because it's effective in foreign policy, but it's because it's effective at home. But then the other part of it is, as Narges said, is that if sanctions don't get lifted at all, if the conclusion of the countries is that once sanctions come, there is no reason why the United States would lift them. Because in a regular war, there is such a thing called ceasefire. You stop shooting, I stop shooting. There's no such quid pro quo really with sanctions. So you say, you abandon your nuclear program, but I will not lift the sanctions, or I will keep the sanctions for other reasons, which means that I do not stop shooting. Right. If you don't stop shooting, the only way the other side can get you to stop shooting is to behave even worse than they did before. In other words, if kicking you in the shin caused sanctions, but if I stop kicking you in the shin, you don't stop sanctions, now I'm going to hit you in the face. Maybe you will stop sanctions. Well, not just why not? It's not out of anger. It becomes strategy. It becomes sanctions management strategy. So if Iran was enriching uranium at 20%, and it finally got the United States to the table to lift sanctions, but sanctions didn't get lifted. In fact, sanctions grew, became bigger after Iran complied with the deal. Now Iran says, well, maybe I should go to 90%, right? In other words, there is no quid pro quo. I mean, sanctions are uneven as a tool of war. And there is very little incentive to lift it. And I have to add here that unlike wars which are declared by presidents, sanctions are sticky in the sense that Congress can impose sanctions on its own. It can prevent lifting of sanctions. So in the end, sanctions are very easily implemented and are not lifted at all, or are lifted with great deal of difficulty. Now, in a game of chess, the other side's strategy begins to coalesce around this reality. So if you're in an economic war with the United States, the way you calculate surviving, gaining leverage, getting the United States to do something is becomes very different. The United States can impose sanctions on Iran and forget about Iran, right? It doesn't do anything to the United States that Iran is under sanctions. So the Iranians basically would say, well, we need to behave worse in order to get US attention. So it has actually the adverse incentive built into it of encouraging the other side to actually become more aggressive and more to behave worse in order to basically get the United States to do the minimum on sanctions.
It's interesting, and I'm glad that you brought up the parallels with war, because as I was getting ready for the interview, and I was reading about how the focus of sanctions was to target the civilian population. One of the target uses of sanctions was to target the civilian population, and what that reminded me of was those very early air power theorists who advocated for strategic bombing. Just bomb the civilians into submission. They'll put pressure on their governments, and that will, lead the war, hopefully lead the war to end more quickly in our favor. That didn't exactly work, but it led to a lot of damage. And it sounds like that's kind of what we're looking at with sanctions as well. So to maybe, I don't want to get too far down the road of, looking ahead just yet, because I have some other questions I want to ask before that. But, continuing the parallels between sanctions and, hot wars, is there anything emerging of something like a just war doctrine for sanctions or for economic statecraft? Is this discussion out there? Do you imagine what something like this might look like?
Well, one of the reasons, we wrote this book for lots of different reasons. One of them being that sanctions are actually something that we don't often talk about. Since the start of the 21st century, US sanctions have increased by over 900%.
900%.
That's a statistic from the US Department of Treasury itself.
That's incredible.
It is a huge tool that we are using, and more people and more states around the world are coming under some form of US sanctions. And yet, and as Vadi said, something happens, we don't know what to do about it, so we just put more sanctions on a place. But we are not talking about what these sanctions actually do. The folks who are having these conversations are specialists in the field of sanctions or are policymakers, but it's not a part of the wider conversation. Second of all, sanctions are extremely abstract things, right? It's not like a bomb is dropping somewhere and you can take a photograph of it and show the kinds of damage that happened.
Right.
These are regulations that come out written by lawyers and bankers. They're very vague. And so it's really difficult to sort of think about, okay, these words on this paper, what is it going to do in this society that's over there? So part of what we were trying to do is to really, in a sense, sort of take a good portion of this is like an anthropological study of what do sanctions do to a society and a political culture.
Because sorry to interrupt, just as an aside, you're a sociologist.
Anthropologist.
Dr. Nasser is a diplomat, international relations professor. I believe Dr. Salehi Esfahani is an economist, and Dr. Vaez is a nuclear physicist. So just as a quick aside, that's an incredible range of expertise that you're bringing to the table when you do this kind of anthropological study. I can't think of a lot of books that have leveraged something like this before.
Well, it was also pretty difficult to write. So
that's it.
In that
you got it out. That's what matters.
Methodologies together.
Right. And part of, one of the things we wanted to do, and by bringing together people, these different minds who look at issues in different perspectives, is to try to provide as much of a holistic image and also reality of what sanctions do, because they're not just like warfare. right? Hot wars don't just do one thing to a society, they do multiple things, and you have to kind of consider them that way. But sanctions, oftentimes, it's usually the economists who are writing about it from a macro level, or IR folks who are writing about it again from a macro level. And we wanted to bring it down to the human size, whether it's society or whether it's within what's happening in the politics and military culture of Iran. So that's on the one side. Now, the other thing is as you started out your question, which is, when we begin to see in actuality what sanctions are doing to a society, you can begin to appreciate the collective punishment of sanctions. Because even when they are supposed to be targeted, as we started out this conversation, it's actually not the people at the top who are being hurt by it. Actually, they're being helped by it exponentially. It's the people. It has a trickle down effect, and that trickle down effect is widespread in society. So it does have these moral questions that we need to begin to ask ourselves. And part of what we wanted to do with this book, sort of an offering that we have with this book, is to start these conversations, first of all, in ways that people can have language and to begin to understand what sanctions do. But second of all, so that we can begin to have a critical conversation. If we are increasing sanctions by over 900% in 24 years, what are we doing? What are the moral implications of that? What does it mean? And do we need things like just war sort of theories and regulations when it comes to economic warfare in the same ways that we have with hot war?
So, going back to the human level, I want to talk about the Iranian public a little bit because, presumably they are, well, not presumably, they are the ones who have been suffering the most. You talk about the middle class in Iran declining to about 20% of the population, which, along with the 900% number, was also very shocking as I was doing the prep for this. And I'm curious to know what the Iranian public, what the Iranian street thinks about all this. Who do they blame for this situation? Do they understand that, my impression of the Iranian public is that they are generally well informed on foreign policy, or this is something that's on their mind. So do they understand the purported motivation behind the US sanctions? Do they blame the United States? Do they blame their government? Do they blame everyone? Is it just, shared equally? Yeah. What's their impression of this?
Vali, do you want to start with that?
Well, I mean, I'll put it at a higher level, but I think Narges has done sort of field conversation with a lot of different people. I think, as you said, the Iranian public is sophisticated enough to know that, yes, its government's foreign policy is at fault. But also at the same time, that the United States has also been acting in bad faith, particularly after the nuclear deal that Iran signed, and for better or worse, did its part, implemented it. It's vouchsafed by the International Atomic Energy Agency 11 times. And the United States just decided to pocket all the wins and walk away from it, and then punish Iran for actually basically complying with the deal with maximum pressure, right? So they also understand that, yes, whatever's the fault of their own government's foreign policy, that the United States also was duplicitous here. And secondly, that the United States, from one side of its mouth, says that it really cares about the Iranian people, it feels for them, it supports them, it wants them to be free, democratic, and prosperous, and yet it's crushing them, right? And so if somebody can't get medicine, or they fully well understand that there is some kind of injustice, if you would, in these sanctions. And I have to say, the same moral hazard that applied to saturation bombing, let's say, even applies today to the Gaza war, for instance, target civilians, is that you either have to say that the entire civilian population is complicit with the state. In other words, all Germans, all Japanese, or Palestinians are equally guilty as the imperial government during the war, Nazis, or Hamas, which is not what the United States is saying about Iran. It actually says the opposite. That we believe that this government is isolated, has no support, right? So or that you have to sort of say that the moral hazard is that you basically see it as acceptable that you would break the will of a people by punishing them collectively, or that you believe that it's the responsibility of the people to change the foreign policy of their government. But we never say that that's what we're doing. right? We're not saying that we're putting pressure on Iranians in order for Iranians to get rid of their government. But we're basically saying we're punishing the government. And I think all of these things the Iranian public understands that, but they also understand that if the United States really believes that the Iranian government is bad, it's unrepresentative, that it's dictatorial, and it's brutal, etc., that it's basically using the Iranian people as a ramrod against its own government. So end of the day, they are sort of hapless, foot soldiers being forced into being hapless instruments in an American foreign policy action. So both sides, in my opinion, depending on time, are viewed by the Iranian public as being guilty, if you would, morally being guilty. Narges, but you have more experience with actually what people on everyday have said.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to this question of who does the society blame, or, actors within a society blame for things like their economic well-being or under a sanctions regime, I think it's also important to note here that economic sanctions, especially when they are, as long as they have been on a country like Iran or Cuba or, Venezuela or Russia in different ways, and they are so comprehensive, it is not just economic sanctions that are taking place. Economic sanctions are part of a broader policy, and part of that policy includes things like media warfare, things like cyber warfare, things like covert operations, right? So it is a much broader form of economic sanctions are a driving force, but there's all of these other policies around it. And the reason that I'm bringing that out is because along with economic sanctions, Iran and Iranians in particular have been on the receiving end of millions and millions of dollars spent over years on different forms of media warfare. And so what that has done is that, and these are, dozens of channels, satellite channels broadcast into Persian and Iran on a 24-hour basis, as well as websites and social media and all of that. And part of what that is attempting to do is to pit the blame in various ways, and to say that if only your government would do X, Y, or Z, then you will not be under the kind of pain that you are. Now, in some ways, these kinds of pressures do work, especially over time, as people see that their food baskets are becoming smaller and all of that. But so there have been moments and there have been like ebbs and flows when I track them over time. And when I talk to people, that the blame gets shifted in different spaces, whether it's on the government itself or their foreign policy or on the United States. But the bigger sort of thing is that when you have moments like right now you do with Gaza and the types of policies that the United States is pursuing vis-a-vis Israel, when that begins, that kind of narrative begins to pop on a bigger level, which has happening over the past 10 months, then everything that has been worked on when it comes to Iran and its sanctions and the media environment around it, that begins to have huge holes in it as well. So then all of a sudden, over time, you begin to have, at the end of the uprisings of 2022 and 2023, there were a lot of Iranians extremely angry at their government and saying that it needs to completely go and it doesn't matter what comes after it. And please stop talking to us about we need to stand up for the Palestinians and why are we so much against Israel and this, that, and the other. And now the conversation is beginning to shift again because of the broader reality around it. So this question of blame in a society is always shifting, but I really, and that's why I don't want to give a straight answer, because there is
no straight answer.
Not straight, but part of it is that it's tied to these broader policies that are taking place.
So final question, when Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the United States and many other countries responded with, one of the biggest sanctions projects in the history of international economic statecraft. So I guess it's a two-part question. One, can this sanctions program against Russia be more effective in its goals than the sanctions programs toward Iran? Two, what can decision makers in this space learn from the experience with Iran as they try to develop something similar towards Russia?
I mean, my short answer is clearly the Russians had watched what sanctions were doing to Iran, and that did not deter them from invasion, right? And that someday maybe it's true of China and Taiwan as well. Secondly, you might have said that because Iran had been under sanctions for 30 years, 40 years, that probably the shock of sanctions would not be great on them. It would be greater on Russia because Russia was integrated into the global economy, etc. But the longer Russia sits under sanctions, the more it's going to look like Iran, which means that the effect of sanctions will only turn Russia more in the direction of Iran. So the Iran experience does not give me any optimism unless the United States and Europe were very clear to Russia that if you leave Ukraine tomorrow, we guarantee that all of these sanctions would be lifted, which is something that's not on the table.
There needs to be a clear end game.
Well, otherwise, Putin will calculate that even if I came out of Ukraine, the sanctions won't go away. They will ask for regime change in Moscow. Even if I left, the sanctions won't go away because somebody else may one day re-invade Ukraine. So if sanctions are permanent, then the way in which you were trying to impose sanctions doesn't work anymore in the mindset of the one you're imposing it on. Narges,
No, I have nothing to add to that. Yeah.
Well, that's all on my side. So Dr. Narges Bajoghli, Dr. Vali Nasser, this is a fascinating and important topic and one that's not going to go away, unfortunately. And I really appreciate both of you taking the time to speak with us this evening, this morning, today, covering all over the time zones all over the world. But once again, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. This has been great.
We appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting us.
This is the Geoeconomics Agenda with Paul Nadeau. Finally, legislatures all over the world decorate their chambers with art to remind themselves of their mission or their history. The chamber of the U.S. House of Representatives contains 23 relief portraits of famous lawgivers throughout history. The session chamber of Finland's parliament has allegorical statues of work and the future. The glass dome atop Germany's Reichstag building was designed to symbolize unity and transparency as values of a modern German republic. And hanging in the chamber of the Massachusetts House of Representatives is the sacred cod. The reason the cod can take its place among the lawgivers is because the state of Massachusetts wouldn't have existed without it. In fact, cod is responsible for almost the entire settlement of the Northeast United States and maritime Canada. Viking-age Scandinavians and medieval Basques were probably the first Europeans to cross the Atlantic, establishing settlements that we know of in what's now Newfoundland and Labrador, and possibly even further into the continent given discoveries of Viking coins in Maine, a topic for another podcast. The earliest settlements would have been dry fisheries, where the fish would have been cleaned and dried in the air to be preserved for sale in Europe, where it was an important and relatively affordable source of protein. The cod fishing industry eventually came to be one of the Northeast's most lucrative industries, taking advantage of the proximity to the Grand Banks, the series of underwater plateaus that form a rough line from Cape Cod to Newfoundland, which were one of the world's richest fishing grounds. Contemporary accounts said that one could cross the ocean on the backs of the cod, and William Pitt the Elder described the fish as British gold. The merchants of New England particularly made a fortune not just in fishing for cod, but also in trading the fish for molasses from the Caribbean, which they processed into rum to make even more sales. All this commerce led to the rise of towns like Boston, Salem, and Marblehead, and enriched merchant families like that of John Hancock, one of the authors of the Declaration of Independence, whose family manor stood on Beacon Hill in Boston, on the site of what's now the Massachusetts State House, where, today, the sacred cod is displayed in commemoration of that legacy. That's all for this episode, but stay tuned for more on the way. Until then, we want to talk about what you want to hear about, as well as take your questions for our show. So send us an email at geoeconomicagenda@ihj.global. Be sure to like, rate, subscribe, wherever you get your podcasts. Tell your friends, and most of all, keep listening. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to the team at API for making this happen, and we'll talk to you next time.